Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be with you guys. So for those that don't know me, I'm going to do a quick little brief introduction. My name is Joseph Humire. I direct a national security think tank in DC, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But my origins come from two places. One, from the last speaker, we have one thing in common for sure, which was we're both devil dogs. I was in 0211 in the United States Marine Corps for 8 years, which for those that don't know what that MOS is, that's counterintelligence. So I served in counterintelligence with the Marine Corps. I served in Iraq. I served in other parts of the Middle East. I was in Latin America when they finally realized I don't speak Arabic and that I'm not going to learn it, and then so I spoke Spanish. And then my other part of my life was at George Mason University. I studied economics with some of the best economists in the world. Professor, the late Dr. Walt Williams, Dr. Peter Becky, Dr. Peter Leeson, who I think is one of the leading scholars on self-governance, or if any anarcho-capitalists in the room. Don Boudreau, the list goes on. You guys are probably very familiar, as a libertarian audience, very familiar with the scholars at George Mason University. That's what made my pivot to the world of libertarians, because up until that point, I don't think I had a very clearly defined political philosophy. I actually went to George Mason to study what they call it government international politics. It's kind of like political science, but it's not a very strong program at Mason. And I didn't like it. I could tell right away that what they were speaking about was very different from the realities that I saw being in the Middle East. But when I studied economics, this is going to be a little bit interesting, how I got into that field. For those that have ever, I'm sure you guys all know about economics. You've studied Econ 101 principles. So one of the first things that struck me when I took my econ, like principles of micro class, was that it's not all about money, right? It's not all about, Johnny has 5 apples and Sarah has 6, pears and they trade and what's the, it's actually about decisions. It's about incentives. It's about what makes us make certain decisions and how those decisions come about. Human action. Human intelligence works the same way. When you interrogate somebody, I don't want to get too much into this, but when you interrogate somebody, the first thing they teach you in interrogation school is don't pay attention to what they say. Pay attention to the decisions they take. So you do a whole smoke screen of questions that talk about, tell me about your life, tell me about what you think of this, but all you're looking at decisions they take along the roadmap to see how they make decisions and see how incentives align with that. So when I figured out that economics had to do with human action, which is my background in intelligence was dealing with human action, human behavior, immediately got attracted to it. After that, I went to work at a foundation called the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. I see some friends from back in the Atlas days. Glenn, it's good to see you again. And so that kind of solidified my move into the libertarian community. Matter of fact, the think tank that I now direct started at the Atlas Foundation. It started by the former president of the Atlas Foundation, a man named Dr. Alejandro Chafuen, Alex Chafuen. Everybody in the libertarian and liberty movement in Latin America owes a great deal of gratitude to Alex Chafuen. Alex Chafuen is one of the godfathers of this movement in Latin America. He helped set up think tanks like Libertad Desarrollo in Chile, like Fundación Libertad in Argentina, like, many other think tanks. Universidad Francisco Mariquín, he didn't set that up, but he's very involved with Muso Ayao in the beginning of Guatemala. For those that have not gone to visit UFM in Guatemala, that is like a libertarian paradise. You actually go there, they have Hayek and Mises on the walls, literally, and the names of their conference rooms. And then from there, I left Atlas and I took this think tank that was basically a small program at Atlas, and I spun it off into an actual national security think tank. Today, in 2021, we've been around for roughly about 10 years as an independent think tank. And I can say this with good confidence, that we are the leading national security think tank in Washington, D.C., focused on national security issues in Latin America, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So it'll probably be a little bit of a different talk than you've gotten before. I'm going to talk to you about what I deal with on a day-to-day basis with this geopolitics, national security issues, emerging threats. And to do that, and I realize there's some folks that are not from the region in the audience, so to do that I want to do a little bit of a, and let's see if technology helps me on this. This next slide, yeah. I want to do a little bit of a review. And for some of you this might be very basic, but I think it's worth doing for just a few minutes of what's transpired in Latin America over the last 10 years, last 20 years. So there's been two major political shifts in Latin America over the last 20 years that have redefined the region in the 21st century. Unfortunately, in many respects, redefine it more towards socialism. The first wave was called the pink tide. This is the wave that Hugo Chavez essentially started with Fidel Castro in Cuba, that essentially took socialism into power in his country and then sparked an alliance throughout Latin America that took socialism to countries like Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador for a time being, Argentina, Brazil. Anyhow, so these populist socialist movements emerged throughout Latin America and for a time being pretty much dominated the politics in the region. I think one of the Venezuelan students or one of the Venezuelans that was here earlier mentioned UNASUR. They created all different kinds of constructs to be able to change the political dynamics in the region, particularly in South America. Oh, sorry. I'll do it. Yeah, no te preocupes. Seguro. The second decade of the 21st century, from 2010 roughly 2020, was defined by the political pendulum swinging towards the right. A lot of these leftist Latin American leaders left power. Not all of them. Some of them obviously maintained, like Hugo Chavez died, Maduro came to power. But many of them did end up leaving office. Lula obviously infamously got incarcerated. Dilma Rousseff lost. President Bolsonaro won. You could say this period was a little bit not as clearly defined. I want to say it's the full 10 years. And the moniker of conservative wave is a moniker that was given, is not my moniker, because I don't think all the presidents were conservative. But it was a shift to the right. But there was a major difference in these two time periods in these political players. And why I believe the initial period, the pink tide, created specific structures that allowed them to dominate the politics in the region to this day, even when they were not in official power. The first is that they developed non-state networks. So when Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Daniel Ortega, Rafael Correa were in power during the first decade of the 21st century, during the pink tide, they didn't just depend on their executive power. They depended on a series of NGOs, a series of associations, a series of civil society actors that they empowered, and in some cases financed with illicit money, such as money that came from the FARC. And they developed a non-state network that persisted even when they weren't in presidency. That's how Cristina Kirchner comes back into power in Argentina, how Rafael Correa almost comes back into Ecuador despite being convicted of corruption, and why Lula da Silva in Brazil is now, despite being a convicted felon, is now potentially going to run for another term in office in Brazil. The other aspect that the conservative wave did not do that differentiates from the pink tide was that the center-right presidents that came into power during the second decade, which you name Sebastián Piñera in Chile, Mauricio Macri in Argentina, President Duque in Colombia, President Bolsonaro in Brazil, and there's a string of President Kuczynski for a while in Peru. The difference was the center-right presidents of Latin America lacked a geopolitical vision. While their contemporaries on the left clearly aligned their countries with a different series of actors in the international order. Where Bolivia once was a good partner with the United States, with Europe, later became a very close partner to Iran, to Russia, to China. All the countries on the Bolivarian Alliance did the same thing. But when the center-right presidents, the more market-friendly presidents came into power, while they were very much more amicable to opening relations with the United States, Europe, and other Western countries, they continued to do deals with China, with Russia, including in some cases even with Iran. They did not see the shifting tides of geopolitics that was happening throughout the region, which is why today we're running a serious crisis where Latin America, especially South America, is turning towards the radical left. So one of the things that we kind of identified as this was going on was how this was happening, right? So I told you there's a little bit of context, a little bit of background, but what is going on? Like why is there so much instability in a region that, Latin America's always had problems, but we're seeing things that we haven't ever seen before. I think some of our friends were talking about Venezuela a little bit ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about Venezuela because Venezuela is one of those things that is changing the landscape of what we know about Latin America. From the United States perspective, oftentimes Latin America is considered a foreign policy backwater. It's the last part of a policy conversation. It's the last point in a press clipping. It does not get the attention that it merits from Washington. But things are changing. One of those things is Venezuela. But one of the things we've learned is how Latin America has now become a region dominated by warfare. Now, I use the word warfare, and for many of you, I'm sure the connotation of that is tanks and soldiers and airplanes and aircraft carriers. But that's never been what defines warfare. So what is war? You have to start with that premise. What is war? There's actually an old famous that was misattributed to Trotsky that said, you may not care about war, but war cares about you. So what is war? Very simply defined, warfare is simply compulsion. If I can compel my adversary to bend to my will, I will win a war. That act of compulsion doesn't require force. If I could manipulate him to bend to my will, if I could persuade him to bend to my will, or if I can even just trick him to doing what I need to do, I can have him bend to my will. I'll get back to that slide in a second, actually. If you study in any war college or any typically military command staff college in the United States, most in Latin America, in Europe, you're going to learn about Karl von Clausewitz. He's considered the great Prussian theorist on war, particularly conventional warfare. And what Karl von Clausewitz would say is that war is the continuation of politics by other means. What does he mean by that? That means when you're talking about compelling your adversary to bend to your will in the act of nation states, you're inherently talking about political will. One country's political will imposing on another country's political will. But that's conventional warfare. That's not how wars are fought today's day and age. The flip side of politics by other means is what the godfather of socialism had said, which is politics is the continuation of war by other means. Meaning that for Vladimir Lenin, for socialism, warfare is a constant. They're never not in war. And even if they don't have forces on the ground or fighting in that conventional sense that you may think that defines what war is, they're honestly on a political battlefield and by extension are fighting their war. This is what you may hear in some circles, in some defense circles, they call asymmetric warfare. And my friend Carlos Chacon, I think, is going to talk about this in more detail tomorrow. This is something very relevant for Latin America. This is something very relevant to what happened in Venezuela and extremely relevant to what's happening today in Colombia. Because asymmetric warfare, what that means in a very basic way, I give courses on this to the Special Forces and to other war colleges throughout Latin America. And what it means in very basic terms is the state does not have the monopoly on force. What that means basically is that military force is not the center of gravity to win a war. You cannot win a war anymore with bombs, bunkers, and bullets. I mean, in the United States, we're hearing about Afghanistan. We could have been in Afghanistan 50 years, but we're never going to win that war. And I was in Iraq twice, and I can tell you that, I was in 2003 during the initial march up, and then when President Bush put the big sign, and I think it was in April of 2003, mission accomplished, that's when the war began. That wasn't when the war ended. And we didn't get very far. Asymmetric warfare is defined by what they call the center of gravity shifts from military force to public opinion. You win wars today by narratives. You build narratives, you defend narratives, you gain legitimacy, and you delegitimize your adversary. You don't have to use conventional military and police to do that. Hugo Chavez literally took over that country and basically spread everything throughout the region without one military soldier. And probably the most defining, what we call him, politician or political figure in the 21st century, which is causing a lot of pain, not just for the Venezuelans, for all the countries that have dealt with it. Bolivians, Nicaraguans, now Colombians. So it's important to understand that you are in a conflict. And it's not just about having good ideas. You have to take those ideas to action, and you have to understand the contemporary conflict that you're fighting. With that, let me ask, I have this PowerPoint, I think, all out of order, so I'm just going to ignore it for a second. Let me ask, who are we fighting? Because in any kind of conflict, you have to know your adversary. So who are we fighting? And this is something that I have a lot of time conversations with, because I think this has been a big part of our evolution and understanding of places of things like Venezuela and other parts, Cuba and other parts of the region, that it's been hard to define who we're fighting. And what I've described is that in the 21st century, there's been changes that are happening to the international order that we have to pay attention to, especially libertarians have to pay attention to this, because it's going to threaten primarily your interpretation of your livelihood. We're entering an authoritarian era. I think COVID just literally accelerated all this. It might have been, took place over the next 10, 15 years, 20 years, is now taking place within the next 2, 3, 4 years. But behind this authoritarian impulse is how the international order is shifting from what was once a bipolar world, which was clearly defined by the United States and the Soviet Union, the Cold War, we remember that shifted to a unipolar world after the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, which some academics and experts considered even the end of history, as was written by Francis Fukuyama. But in the 21st century, we have entered a multipolar world, meaning that the United States is no longer the only power, on the globe. We've entered a multipolar world where other powers have emerged, not in a conventional sense in terms of their economies or their militaries, but have emerged in terms of their strategies of hegemony and conflict and conquest. In today's day and age, and I'm going to actually borrow something that was said by Jose Maria Aznar, who is a former prime minister from Spain. There was a conference in Quito, Ecuador, before the inauguration of the new president, Guillermo Lasso. For those that don't know the case in Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso comes to some degree from the liberty movement. He was a member of the Fundación Internacional para la Libertad, which is presided by Mario Vargas Llosa. He also had a think tank called Fundación Ecuador Libre that helped him understand his policy ideas. That's kind of like the IEA, for what IEA was for Margaret Thatcher. Fundación Ecuador Libre was for Guillermo Lasso. Hopefully it'll have the same impact. But before he was inaugurated, they had all these well-known Latin American liberty movement champions in Quito. And Jose Maria Aznar, who was at that meeting, said something that grabbed my attention, and, especially for someone with his prestige. He said, in today's day and age, you cannot understand Ecuador, you cannot understand Colombia, you cannot understand Venezuela, you cannot understand the United States unless you understand Russia, China, and Iran. That is an alliance that is real. That is an alliance that has already formed. It's unnatural. Russia and China are not historic partners. In fact, I believe Russia acquired or seized territory from China before. In the Cold War, they were competitors at best, adversaries at worst. Iran is an Islamic republic. It probably has nothing to do with atheist communists from back in the Soviet era. But in today's day and age, these external actors have decided they pin their hopes on one thing, that the enemy of their enemy is their friend. And that enemy is all you guys. Your way of life, your way of thinking is going to be threatened directly by these three actors. It's not just about the globalist forces or the movement of ideas. There's specific regimes with specific plans, with clearly defined strategies on how to turn the world into an authoritarian era. And they're gaining traction, especially in Latin America. This isn't the first time this has happened. If we go back 100 years ago, before the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was declining in the Middle East, when the Japanese were waning in Asia, unnatural alliances were formed, right? The German Empire, the Japanese Empire, and the Ottomans aligned for what? They didn't have cultural similarities. They weren't agreeing on values and norms. They didn't all have the same ideology. They aligned themselves because they wanted to preserve the international order. They wanted to keep the geopolitical landscape in the way they was, which was monarchies. That's what they believed in. And had the world wars ended differently, the 20th century might not have been what we have learned today. Capitalism might not have surged the way we've seen it surge in the 20th century. But we're getting that challenge again. And my sort of call to action, and one of the main reasons I'm very glad that you invited me, I'm very glad to be here, besides with a lot of friends, and always feel at my home with the Liberty Movement in Latin America. But beyond that is I want to compel everybody here to take very seriously the geopolitical landscape, to understand these three actors, and to understand how they're moving it. And I want to talk a second about Venezuela, because I believe we have some Venezuelans in the room. This is one of the things that at my center, at SFS, we have dedicated a tremendous amount of time, energy, and resources to understand. You guys might know from the news, or maybe are involved or read about the last administration's efforts to essentially change the scenario in Venezuela. Right? The strategy was called maximum pressure. That means they were going to isolate the Maduro regime, to have more than 50 countries that took Nicolas Maduro out of the political landscape. They recognized another president, actually, the interim president, Juan Guaido, per the Venezuelan constitution. And they sanctioned Venezuela, probably one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, next to North Korea and Iran. The idea was to pressure Venezuela and the Maduro regime specifically, economically and politically, so that they could look for an opportunity for the Venezuelan opposition to take power into their own hands. It didn't work. It failed. One of the reasons it failed was the diagnostic was incorrect. If you have a bad understanding of the threat, you will have a bad solution or policy strategy to deal with it. So what did we hear about Venezuela going back 4 or 5 years ago? It's a socialist country, absolutely it is. But we've seen socialism in Latin America before. Right? Socialism is not a new concept. Venezuela did not bring socialism to Latin America. We have seen that time and again. We say, wait a minute, it's not just socialism. They did that, but it's also a narco state. It's got a lot of, basically it's a cartel that runs that country. Well, we've seen narco states in Latin America as well. Right? You have Manuel Noriega in Panama, remember that? They say, you know what? It's not just the narcos, it's not just socialism, it's the Cubans. The Cubans, they control that country. They've been wanting to get after Venezuela forever. We've seen Cuban occupation in Latin America. Grenada. So if it's not just the Cubans, and it's not just socialism, and it's not just narcotics or narco states, drug cartel, what is it? So one of the things that I want to share the story with you real quick, because one of the things I've done over the last several years is travel to all different countries in Latin America, including here in Colombia, also to Brazil and other places, to speak with presidents, ministers, and others to help them understand the seriousness of what is the Venezuela conflict. And I'm going to give you a story, and what I want you to do is I want you to visualize who I'm talking about as I talk about him. I'm going to describe a person, and I want you just to visualize in your head who I'm talking about. So the story starts with the lieutenant colonel who had high political ambitions, who tried to capture his country by force but failed, only to be eventually elected democratically. But immediately once he became president, he nationalized his resources, particularly petroleum, and he used the windfall profits to fund a revolution in his country and throughout his region, all the while accusing his adversaries of imperialists that are going after him. And this lieutenant colonel turned president died after 14 years of natural causes after 14 years. So, does anyone know who I'm talking about? Chavez? Do we have a yay on Chavez? That story absolutely does describe Chavez, but I'm not talking about Chavez. I'm talking about Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. So why is the story of Lieutenant, for those who don't know who Nasser was the president of Egypt, who sparked the Pan-Arab nationalist movement that dominated Middle Eastern conflicts for the greater part of the 20th century, who, by the way, was socialist, one of the biggest socialists that came to the Middle East, who unified Egypt and Syria and created something called the United Arab Republic under the vision of what the Ottomans called the Greater Syria. Before there was Greater Colombia, Gran Colombia, there was a Greater Syria. My point to that is, to understand Venezuela, you have to understand the Middle East. Venezuela is a conflict like something we've never seen on the Western Hemisphere. It is not just Cuba. It is not just narco-trafficking. I won't bore you with more details on that, but that is a profound understanding of what's happening in Venezuela, and one of the reasons we don't understand that level of conflict in the Western Hemisphere. So that brings me to us, right? I told you a little bit about my transformation into the liberty movement, into the classical liberal world. And I think our contemporaries, you pick them. And one of my favorite is Doug North. I thought Doug North did some of the best work at understanding at a very serious level the importance of institutions as a bedrock of the rule of law that allows the market economy to thrive. But our contemporaries, whether it's Mises or Hayek, they all lived through this totalitarian era. I mean, they lived through Nazi rise in Germany. They lived through even the early areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they knew very well what the cost of freedom is. They knew very well that if you do nothing, if you do not correctly identify your adversaries, that you can lose everything. And my call to all my friends here in the auditorium today is to put aside your differences. Whether you're more conservative leaning or more anarcho-capitalist leaning, I don't care. If you believe in individual liberty, if you believe in free markets, and you believe in national security, you're on the right side of things. And put aside your differences, because I've seen too much. In my time with the liberty movement, I've seen too much squabbling over simplistic differences. When at the end of the day, when the challenge comes, when the fight comes to your doorstep, you are all going to be in the same line. Whether you're anarcho-capitalist, whether you're libertarian, whether you're conservative, you're all going in the same place. Because your fundamental belief structure on individual sovereignty, individual decision-making, is at the core of what's being changed. There is no individual liberty in China. There is no individual liberty in Iran. In Russia, as much as Putin likes to propagandize and make himself as the leader of the Western values, he persecutes anyone that thinks differently in Russia. There is no civil society in Russia that can actually thrive, and much less the press. These three actors have decided to change the international order, and they're winning. They're beating us. So when I was in the Marine Corps, one of the other things I did, I was a martial arts instructor in the Marine Corps. And when I was in the Marine Corps, one of the things I did was I taught other Marines on what they call the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, MCMAP. And in that, I would tell them, and this was something I learned from my instructor, was that you never lose a fight. You win or you learn. But the only way you learn is when you are losing, you take a step back, you reflect, and you think about why you lost. The elections in Peru, the elections that are coming up in Colombia, the elections are coming up in Brazil, the elections that they took away from Venezuela, the elections that happen in Argentina. We have to think very carefully why we're losing. Because if not, we're going to lose for here to infinity, and then the 21st century is not going to be nothing like the 20th century. And these conferences are not just going to be conferences of friends getting together, but they'll be considered illicit actions. Like having this conference in Venezuela is considered almost like a terrorist action against the state. That's the way they define that stuff. That's how much they fear free thinking. So that's my message to you, is to essentially don't ignore the geopolitical realities that are around you. It's all great to be consumed by great ideas, by great thinkers. And I am consumed myself. But there's a real politic to how things are playing today in today's day and age. And everybody in this room is needed to help ensure that the authoritarian actors and that authoritarian wave that's coming to not just Latin America, but it's coming to the world, does not dominate for the next years to come. With that, I probably way shorter on time than what I'm supposed to, but maybe I'll open it up and hopefully we have a few questions and I can have a dialogue with you guys. But thank you again. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm incredibly impressed that they have a Libertarian conference in Colombia. I'm incredibly impressed. When I was at Atlas, I mean, just so you know, I was the director of Institute Related, meaning I looked at all the think tanks in the world and what we were doing on free market policies. We didn't have many think tanks in Colombia. We didn't even really know many libertarians in Colombia. Like, much less this room, we would probably fit in those two tables, the people that we had that we could count on to push free market policies in Colombia. Chile, we had a bunch. Argentina, we had more than probably wanted. Mexico, we had a lot. But in Colombia, we had none. And so I think there's some people in this room that have done a great job of growing the movement. And hopefully here in a few years, we come back and this room's going to be twice the size with twice the people. So thank you again for organizing this. Anyone have questions? Okay, well, how does that work?
You tell me who you want to take questions from and I'll...
Okay, sure. The gentleman in the back, the red shirt.
Hey, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I was extremely surprised to hear this point of view coming out of a North American-based libertarian thinker. And I'm from the United States, but my primary focus has been in Latin America for the last several years, and that shifted my thinking about geopolitics and my thinking about all that very much in your direction. And then I look north to the North American libertarian movement, and I wonder, when you talk about narratives, and how narratives are so important in what's going on, I wonder about the narratives being pushed in many parts of the North American libertarian movement, and I wonder what your reaction to those are, and where you think the North American libertarian movement needs to go in order to be supportive of the libertarian movement in Latin America. Okay, that's a great question. I will say that I don't identify myself as a libertarian. I call myself a classical liberal because I think it's a bit of a broader tent. My knowledge of the great thinkers in the classical liberal tradition come from more the economic realm. I did study economics. That's my background, academically. So I'm not part of a libertarian party or anything. I work at a think tank, and one of the things that I think is important for people to understand, for civil society to function effectively, is not just all activism. It can't just be good libertarians on the streets making good slogans and making good campaigns. You need technocrats. You need policy professionals that could turn ideas into policy proposals. And then on top of that, you need the academics, the idea generators out. And so the policy people, what Hayek would have called the secondhand dealers of ideas. So I'm in the realm of technical policy. So when I'm in Washington, I don't walk around with a libertarian flag. I basically speak to political folks or Defense Department or other people. But in my heart, I come from the liberty movement. And so I know the principles and the traditions that have founded this movement, and that I think is one of the reasons that this movement is going to continue to grow, because it's very strong. It's founded on strong, solid philosophy. But my mission isn't to carry the libertarian flag all around Washington. My mission is to basically build policies for the national security of the United States that are going to make sure that we don't lose the United States. But to your question specifically, I have noticed a trend, both here in Latin America and the United States, of subversion and infiltration by some of these actors, I'll name by Russia, that has specifically targeted libertarians because they understood that libertarians are inherently anti-state. And because they have that inherent part of their ideology, Russia has made an effort to co-opt many libertarians, unsuccessfully in many instances, but in Latin America, unfortunately, successfully in some instances. We've identified some folks that actually took paychecks from Putin for this. So this is these are professionals. They do this for a living, right? You go to Cuba, you might think it's cool, you want to go check it out, come back. The Cuban intelligence, the Cuban G2, they're serious. You operate here in Colombia, you move around with Venezuela. I mean, these are regimes that are professionals. They do this for a living.
And so to think that that won't happen, and I can tell you, even at Atlas, we were always worried. We would have big conferences. We meet people from all over the world, from every corner of the world. We don't have the assets or resources to know if everyone is who they say they are, if they're not running around with another alternative agenda. And so that is a problem, but I don't think that should stop what you guys are doing, but just be prudent and vigilant about that. I mean, that's a reality of the world. I think we had one here, and then we go to the left after that. Jose.
Yes, Joseph, great presentation, even though I missed the very beginning.
No worries.
But it's good to see you here and talking about that, and I just want to congratulate you for your emphasis on security and the threat that Venezuela represents now, because it is the largest humanitarian crisis, security crisis of the continent. And it was reading also this paper, fantastic. I love your focus. And the links also with the drug dealers here and in the Middle East, which is a national crisis. And also, you see, Liberty International did a great effort to have 15 young Venezuelans.
I saw that, yeah.
This is truly incredible. So anyway, if you want to talk about the links with the drugs a little bit more,
Yeah, sure.
That is really horrible.
So let me say this, because I'm in front of a room of libertarians. I'm inherently in favor of drug legalization. Especially with marijuana. I think that conversation's already, that ship sailed. It's way too late in some countries. But here's the thing you have to understand. This isn't really about drugs, right? This is about networks. Mexico isn't dominated by drug cartels. It's dominated by transnational organized crime. You legalize cocaine, they move on to forestry. You do something, move on to human trafficking. This has fundamentally to do with how specific incentives are shifting from production to predation, right? The basic of any economics, right? Incentives. If incentives for predation are greater than the incentives for production, the illicit economy is going to always overshadow the formal economy. So free markets won't thrive because they'll break down the rule of law. And so in the case of Venezuela, there's an effort to use drug trafficking not just as an inherent activity for illicit profit, but to use it as an intelligence network. It's what some colleague in the defense world calls a criminalized state, meaning that as opposed to a typical drug cartel and a government where there's corruption, the cartel buys influence with a politician and gets a kickback and then able to move his drugs. That's the classic case. A criminalized state is when the state apparatus, meaning the Ministry of Interior, the Immigration Agency, the Customs Agency, becomes an organ within a broader element of organized crime. One of the best ways you see it in Venezuela is through immigration. Most countries will use their immigration services to try to detect or deter criminals or terrorists from coming in to protect the population. Venezuela provides documentation to criminals and terrorists to conceal their identities to be able to move around the world. And so the criminalization of a state is something that Venezuela has kind of pioneered to some level. I don't know if many people have done it that way, at least not here in Latin America. And if you think about it, right, a drug network is like an intelligence network. A secret meeting, a secret transit, a secret payment. You got to hide everything. You use pseudonyms. You use front companies. So Hugo Chavez understood that if I could take my government and fuse it with the drug cartels, I can have access to things that traditionally I won't have with complete degree of plausible deniability. So Venezuela is a very worrisome case. It is one of the most complex things in the world, next to probably only Syria. And it's something that merits a lot of understanding because those 5.6 million refugees that have had to fled that country because of how hard the conditions have been, that's going to be that's something that is untenable and is not going to end well. So. Thank you, Jose, again, for your comments. And actually, you reminded me, we have a report out there. For those that are from Colombia or those that are interested in Colombia, the protests that you saw over the last several months, these were not natural protests. Protests in Latin America aren't new. And my parents are from Bolivia, and I don't remember a time that I was traveling to Bolivia when I was a kid, and I didn't run into a protest on the way from the airport. You're stuck in traffic, wait out the protest, go see the grandmother. What we're seeing today is the weaponization of protests. Because there are people that have grievances, and they express their grievances through a protest, which is fine. But then there's other groups that subvert the protest, that have no identity, they don't identify with the cause, but they steer the protest in a direction towards violence and vandalism with one intention: to cause chaos. And couple that with high levels of disinformation. Actually, that is one thing I forgot I was going to mention. Slides were all out of order, and I'll just do it real quick because it is worth showing you guys. So we saw this in Chile. This is asymmetric warfare. Because what we saw in Chile was, during the Chile protest, just to contextualize it, there was a 4-cent hike in public transit. Right? Basically, the subway, they raised it by 4 cents. So the Chileans that went out to protest, first peacefully, then burned down the entire metro station, attacked the police stations, attacked the military, created a tremendous amount of mess to basically put President Piñera down to his knees and force him to rewrite his constitution, which is now, by the way, probably going to end up becoming a socialist constitution. Chile is a lesson. Chile is the most free market country in Latin America. It's the top of most of the indexes, if not all the indexes, particularly of those of economic freedom. And if they could break down Chile and turn it into a socialist country, they could break down any country and turn it into a socialist country. One of the ways they did it was through this disinformation. When we and some other folks in Chile participated in a study of 7 million digital interactions in cyberspace, found out that 60% of the content was generated by less than 1% of the accounts. So less than 1% of the accounts was creating all the noise around the protest. And of those 1%, the majority, I think it was like 70% of that 1% of accounts, were geolocated through digital forensics to Venezuela, to Cuba, to Argentina, to Mexico. That means those nodes, you see the green and the red nodes, they were the one that were intensifying the narrative in Chile to take it more towards violence and vandalism. That is the weaponization of a protest. We'll go, oh, yeah, is it? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to go to you in just 1 second. So just a couple of comments and then a question. So my first comment is you define yourself as a classical liberal rather than a libertarian. And as a fellow economist myself, I appreciate that. So I just wanted to say good for you. And the second comment, you mentioned that perhaps the best way to move forward the ideas of economic freedom and respect for property rights and so on is with technocrats, is with policymakers that think of policies or produce policies based on sound science. And I think that is tremendously important. If there is a lesson that I would like to give to the young fellows here in this conference is base your ideas and even your activism, if you're into it, in sound science. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Those were my 2 comments. And my question is,
Sure.
you said, we have to be careful when conflict comes to your doorstep, and you have to be prepared. Now, do you literally mean your doorstep? Or perhaps you think of conflict and, there's conflict in Syria, there's conflict in Iraq, so I have to go there before it comes to my doorstep. And the problem with that is that people would say, well, then the principle of no aggression and so on and so forth. So how do you, at what point you draw the line? You say, it's got to be at my doorstep for me to act, or am I allowed to go and, do other things, the history of the U.S. doing stuff in Latin America and so on.
Yeah, no, two good points. I'll address the first one, which wasn't a question, but I appreciate the comment, and I think the point. There's a concept that maybe would be useful for folks in the room. It's something that the Koch Foundation would work on. It's called the structure of social change, and we used this model when we were at the Atlas Foundation because it essentially layers your model for social change in civil society through 3 layers: intellectuals, policy practitioners, and activists. And so my argument is, oftentimes what we're missing is the policy part. An activist with great energy and great ideas can be an unguided missile without a technocrat that allows it to steer to a real change in the policy landscape. But you really need the 3 to have a really effective strategy for social change. On the latter point it's a question, I guess, about interventionism in general, right? So if you understand, I'll give you the example of Venezuela, and I got in a lot of debates over this, here in Colombia and mostly in the United States. I was against any form of military intervention in Venezuela. Right? That doesn't mean I'm against military actions in any scenario. There are necessities for military action, particularly when there is imminent things that can happen. But usually those military actions are surgical, they're unconventional, and they're hybrid. They have a blend of kinetic and non-kinetic action. In the case of Venezuela, what I told my friends in Venezuela, and this is funny because I got a lot of hate from my friends in Venezuela because they were at a point where they really, really wanted the United States to invade their country, to take out Maduro. I told them there's no scenario, and we war gamed this out at Southcom and other places. There's no scenario that the United States invades Venezuela and we win. It does not exist. I don't know if you guys seen Avengers and the scenario where it's like, 14 million times you lose, that's Venezuela. We will lose every time if we go into that. It's more complex than Afghanistan. So why would we do that? Like, what positive can come out of that? And what was interesting, talking about the disinformation stuff, one of the actors that was amplifying the noise around U.S. intervening in Venezuela was Russia. Because why did Russia want to promote that narrative? Because they wanted to raise the expectation of the Venezuelans to think that the gringos are going to save us. And if we do, they know that's a huge mistake, and we'll get killed on the information operation alone. But if we don't, which we didn't, and if we don't, we will demoralize the Venezuelans. And over time, the Venezuelans will turn anti-American because they will feel like the United States let them down. So in terms of interventions, more often than not, a kinetic military intervention does not deal with the heart and the nature of conflicts in today's day and age. Like Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Venezuela, these aren't conflicts that you solve with conventional military force. But there is a role for targeted interventions, but you have to understand how they fit into a broader strategy. So I hope that answers the question to some degree. I think this gentleman.
One of the big issues, especially in America and other places, seems to be the treason of the academics. Right now we have racial division in our country that has been promoted largely by white college professors. I don't know any African American who wants to have anything to do with BLM. But is this the same problem in Latin America, that you have all these college professors who have just sold out humanity, which seems to be the case in everywhere?
I would let my Latin American friends talk about that more, but I mean, I see the similar symptoms. You see it with the media. The media has done a horrible job at covering things in Latin America, much like they've done in the United States. The academia is very, very left in Latin America. To be a free market, classical liberal thinker in academia, you really have to prove your chops. Because they're going to make, if you're a leftist thinker in academia, and this is my impression, I'll let my Latin American friends tell me if I'm wrong, but if you're a leftist thinker, you have a much easier time at getting promoted, getting tenure, getting accepted, because you're within a community. But if you're a classical liberal thinker, you really have to be good. You have to be some of the best, because you're going to be constantly defending your positions among your contemporaries. Academia is a big part of it. But within all that, with all those elements, I think, I come from the CI world. So I mean, from all the elements, what I see is subversion. I see deliberate attempts at steering institutions within countries to be able to create social division and create scenarios where people turn on one another. In the United States, we're having this problem with racism. And it caught me by surprise. I mean, I grew up in a poor neighborhood as a Hispanic in a black neighborhood. I don't even remember racism being that big of a deal. I mean, we had racism, I mean, it exists, but not like they did in the 60s or the 50s. Like, we've gotten better at that over time, but now all of a sudden it's turned into like the #1 thing in the country. And I don't want to, delegitimize anyone that has that as their cause, but how much of that is organic and how much of that is being pushed by a certain subversive network that might resist within academia. I think the big one that they're talking about now in the US is critical race theory. So it's not really my field, so I won't jump into it, but it kind of boggles my mind to some degree. And so in Latin America, they have some of this, probably not identical because it's a different thing. But to show you one example, like in the Colombian protests, one of the biggest narratives that was being formed was that narrative around defund the police. They want to take away the Colombian police force's resources, and that's a real thing. They actually put a policy proposal together. My friend Carlos Chacon is very much involved in that conversation at the policy level with the Colombian Congress. So, real consequences for some really silly ideas. Any more questions? Have you got two? Oh,
Thank
well,
you.
oh.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
You're welcome to